So let's begin with an intro to Bootstrap. What is it? Why maybe should you care about it? Why might you want to use it? Well, Bootstrap calls itself the world's most popular CSS framework. So we know some of those words. We know all of them except maybe framework we have not talked about. What is a CSS framework? Well, you can think of it sort of like a physical framework for something you're constructing in the real world, whether it's a building or a sculpture, a papier-mâché sculpture where you build something up, and I don't know, this is getting stretched a bit thin here, this whole metaphor, but maybe you've built something like this before. You build the skeleton, or you can actually buy those skeletons. For example, I took a taxidermy course earlier, I guess it was a couple of years ago, and I didn't realize this, but most taxidermy is done using these pre-existing forms you can buy out of foam and different materials, and then you construct everything else on top of it. So here is a bird form for a raven. It doesn't look like much, but you can use this to create all sorts of really interesting things, ranging from very odd choices to somewhat, some people might say, very nice looking or beautiful taxidermy, or revolting depending on your perspective. The point here, though, is that these tools exist to help speed up the process. You could make something without this. It might just take more time, and it might be a little bit more difficult. Bootstrap does the same thing, but for websites. It helps us quickly create nice-looking, responsive, modern websites. So we don't have to write as much CSS as we might. It provides the framework or the starting point for all sorts of different websites. So to get more specific, it really consists of two main things. It consists of a collection of components, different pieces that we can use and just insert into our app. So a button. There are pretty nice looking buttons that are pre-made. Nav bars, it's probably the most commonly used one. But then there's also this thing called the grid system, which we'll spend a good amount of time on, which helps us lay out our websites. So let me start by showing you some examples of the components. I'm on the website getbootstrap.com. It's their main website. On the left side, we have a whole bunch of different components. So things like buttons, as I mentioned. Here are some of the buttons that you can get very, very easily. You don't have to do anything except include the Bootstrap CSS in your document, and then create a button with a particular class name. So no styles have to be written in order to get these buttons or these buttons. We also have things like nav bars, as I mentioned. That's a really common one. So here are some examples. Nav bars with forms, but more importantly, these nav bars are responsive. So as I resize, you'll see that they collapse, and then we get this hamburger icon, and these responsive nav bars that open, they expand as a drawer. So creating that requires a lot of CSS, a good amount of JavaScript. You have to know what you're doing. It takes time. It's a decent amount of code. But if you use Bootstrap, you can get it for free. There's also forms, nice looking forms and different inputs, things like responsive forms. Let's see if this one is responsive as I resize. There we go. Can you see how everything stacks? So this is all stuff we could do on our own. It's just that it's faster, it's simpler if we use a tool like Bootstrap. That's not to say you should always rely on something like Bootstrap, but it's important that you understand they're out there and feel comfortable using at least one of these tools. So there are many. Bootstrap, things like Foundation, Semantic UI, they all serve the same purpose. They all give you this foundation, this basic set of tools to create websites. So now let's talk about the grid system quickly. One of the most annoying parts of creating modern websites is laying out your content, divvying up space. I mean, if we look at this here, there's actually some content, a small amount of content on the left, a larger piece in the middle, and a smaller part on the right. And we've talked about this with Flexbox, but you can see it. This actually disappears or probably goes below at some point. I'm not sure where it goes. It goes somewhere else though, and this takes up the remaining space. And then as I continue to shrink this down, at some point that all collapses into the nav bar, and the whole layout changes, right? It's all changing as the screen size changes. The grid system is a bunch of CSS that is pre-written for us, where we can rely on these particular classes like row and column, or more detailed ones like, if I keep going down here, column-4 or column-small-4. And these all have to do with the size the amount of space that we want certain elements to take up at different screen sizes. So I can very easily say, I want this thing to take up more space on a large size and less space on a smaller size, or vice versa. Let's look at these rows right here. Just look at the top one here. Column medium 8, column 6, column medium 4. We're going to decode all of that. But as I resize, hopefully you can see, eventually, there we go. This thing takes up its entire own line. This thing doesn't. It's only going part of the way across. Or if you take a look at these, there are 3 things sharing the space equally. And then as we shrink down, now they each take up half the space going across. So 50%, 50%, 50%. If I go all the way back to a larger size, 33%, 33, or 33.3333, and so on. Okay, so that's really the point of the grid system, is to help you lay out your websites and have pieces take up space and redistribute that space depending on screen sizes. So we're going to spend more time with this. The last thing I want to mention that always comes up, people ask, aren't our websites all going to look the same if we're all using Bootstrap? And the answer is absolutely they could, but also they don't have to. This is just a quick preview of certain sites that use Bootstrap according to Bootstrap's documentation. So I didn't actually verify that they still use Bootstrap, but all of these at some point have used Bootstrap. Gosh, this website's a real headache. I do love that game, but oof. So some nice looking sites, right? And they all look different. They might all, have a nav bar, and they might all have buttons, but things can be customized with Bootstrap. You can change the colors of the buttons. You can change how they look entirely. You don't have to use the buttons. You could just use the grid system. You can change how the nav bars work. But they all, I'm trying to resize that. They all are fundamentally sort of doing the same thing. They're using Bootstrap to divide up space or to allocate. I want this thing to be, 50% of the screen width or 20%, and then go all the way across on a small screen size. So you can see here, they all go all the way across sort of in a column layout, and then they share the space here. So we can do that with Flexbox, but Bootstrap is going to make it a little bit easier, a little faster for us to do that. Here's a few more examples, and one more. Very different content, very different designs, subject matter, colors, fonts, everything's different. But these all at some point have used Bootstrap to help speed up the development process. So our goal is to spend some time with Bootstrap, right? We're not going to be an expert. I have courses on Bootstrap that are 15 to 20 hours. There's a lot to cover, but fortunately, most of it is very, very easy. So we're going to focus on the essentials so that we can get building nice, responsive, modern websites relatively quickly. Okay,